This is the last video on externalities, and in this video we'll be talking about some common solutions used to fix the problem with externalities. We'll talk through the graph for one of those, a Pigovian tax or subsidy, and then mention the Coase theorem and some other ways to fix these. Before we get started, I want you to think, what are some ways that negative consumption externality, remember that the quantity of gas I use in the market was more than the quantity of gas that was socially optimal. How can we fix that? How can we make consumers use less gasoline? So try and brainstorm like 2 or 3 ways we can do that. Probably one of the first things that came to mind was a tax. Taxes and subsidies, as we discussed when we introduced government policy, frequently their job is to fix a market failure. And that's what we call the fact that the market gets the quantity wrong. So if we're trying to change the quantity of gas consumed to look more like the social optimum, we might use a tax to get us there. And then there is a specific kind of tax named after a French economist, Pigou. A Pigovian tax is a tax that's equal in size to the amount of the negative externality. So if the external cost is 50 cents, then you would do a 50-cent tax. And we know from our prior coverage that it could be on producers or consumers, and it should have the same impact. Shouldn't matter who you put it on, it will correct the externality either way. And vice versa, if you have a situation where you want people to be rewarded for their external benefits, you might use a Pigovian subsidy if you have a positive externality. And again, you can see me do one of those in the optional video. Other government policies that might work if you're trying to reduce the quantity, we know both price ceilings and price floors will get us there. You could also just ban gasoline or put a quota on how much I can buy, or you could do something like cap and trade. That's where you say everyone in the US is only allowed to buy 7 gallons of gas a week, but you could trade those allowances with people who might want to drive more or less than you. And this is just my little plug. If you want to learn more about cap and trade and taxes and policies designed to mitigate negative externalities, especially on the environment, you should totally take EGOV 231 because we spend a lot of time thinking about that. So I want you to just think about what happens when a negative externality is internalized. So just pause and answer this question. Now I'm going to show you what a Pigovian tax equal to 50 cents would look like in the context of that last graph I drew, where we had a negative consumption externality. So remember that graph started by just drawing the market equilibrium, the private demand, the private supply leading to the market quantity and the market price. We said maybe that was 225. We made some equations to figure it out, but just using that to give us some tangible prices. And the problem with gasoline was that there is a social demand curve, which is lower by 50 cents at every point, because we subtract off that external cost of 50 cents. So what society actually wants to have happen is less gas be consumed, and they want the price to fall. And maybe this would be something like $2. So how can they get us there? How can they get us to that social optimum? Well, they could do a tax. The Pigovian tax equal to 50 cents, right, will be exactly equal to the amount of the tax. And the externality will be the same. So a 50-cent tax would shift either the demand curve, so if you put it on consumers, if you say every time you buy gas, you as a consumer send 50 cents to the government, or a supply curve that's up here if you collect it from producers, which is more likely. Remembering back to our tax and subsidy material, it's easier to tax producers because there are less of them. And it's more politically popular usually. So let's assume we're on this new supply curve with the tax. It's a 50-cent tax on gasoline producers. That's going to put us at this new equilibrium where the tax quantity is exactly equal to the socially optimal quantity. That's what we wanted. That is what makes it Pigovian. A tax that was a little too small would lead to more than the socially optimal quantity. A tax that was a little too big would lead to less. And so usually what happens in practice is policymakers will kind of move taxes around, have them be a little flexible, ease them in, see how people react, because they're not exactly sure what the elasticity of these curves looks like and how people will react to the tax, but they might know the amount of gasoline they're targeting for consumption. And then remember that with a tax, there's this wedge between the price that buyers pay and down here, the price that sellers receive. So, and the vertical distance between them is the amount of the externality and the amount of the tax, 50 cents. So it looks here like sellers are going to receive exactly the socially optimal price we wanted them to. They're going to be disincentivized to provide gasoline, and consumers are going to be disincentivized to consume it, which is perfect. So Pigovian tax gets us what we wanted. At the cost of this tax deadweight loss, right? Those are the mutually beneficial transactions that were destroyed as a result of the tax. And so that was all we knew about taxes before. They cause deadweight loss, they harm consumers and producers, but they give the government money. Well, now we know that that Pigovian tax is going to cause deadweight loss, but it's also going to move us to a point where we avoid that red deadweight loss that was already there in the market. So we have green deadweight loss that we've swapped out for red deadweight loss. And it turns out that they're exactly equal in size. The externality deadweight loss and the tax deadweight loss are the same. They have the same base of the difference in quantity and the same height of the amount of the externality. So those two triangles are identical in size. So that's what we call the deadweight loss swap. When we correct externalities with Pigovian taxes, we're going to trade some inefficiency of cutting off some mutually beneficial transactions in order to correct the existing inefficiency of all that gas we were burning not being worth what it cost society. So we're going to move to a place that's better for society, destroy some mutually beneficial transactions, but get rid of the externality deadweight loss. That makes sense? So in some ways, for people that are anti-taxes, because of the inefficiency they cause, they need to recognize that there was an inefficiency there to begin with, if there's an externality. Okay. So we talked about government solutions. Hopefully when you were brainstorming, you also thought of some private solutions. What I mean by private is it's not the government implementing them. And one you might not have heard of before is called the Coase theorem. This is a theorem by an economist called Coase, who believed that the real problem with externalities is not that the government needs to step in, it's that there should be better property rights. So the real problem with gas is that I don't have the right to burn as much gas as I want, a right that is defendable and that someone could pay me to violate. So like if I had the right to burn as much gas as I want, which I actually do, I have a pretty good property right to do that. But if someone could pay me to stop driving, to stop burning gas, then we could bargain down to the socially optimal point. Or we could get the other group, society, to have the property rights. Like if society had the right to no one to burn gasoline because of the impact it has on the environment, but then I could pay society to violate that property right, and I could pay to drive as much as I wanted to drive based on the price they were charging me. Either way, we would bargain to the socially optimal quantity. So this makes a little more sense when we present it in environmental economics with a little more math. But the basic intuition is it doesn't matter which group gets the property rights. If we allow them to trade, they will arrive at the social optimum. With a big if. There cannot be transaction costs, meaning it has to be easy for me to identify who in society is going to pay me to drive, and has to be easy for us to make trades. And we have to be able to enforce the contracts we make. Society has to be able to make sure that if I promise to only drive this amount, then I'm going to do it. This is an idea that you don't necessarily need the government to step in. Private individuals might bargain to the right place, but it's much more likely to happen in the context of a small town. When Coase initially proposed it was like a farmer whose rancher neighbor had cows that were constantly trampling their crops. And so if it's decided that the farmer has the right to not have the cows on his property, and the rancher has to pay every time they violate that, then they would bargain to the right amount of cow trespassing. But we know that there are oftentimes lots of transaction costs. It's hard to identify the parties that you're harming, and it's pretty hard to enforce contracts. So the Coase theorem doesn't always work out in reality. Another thing that might work is just shaming people. Shame people for driving, or incentivize them not to drive. Give them prime parking spots if they have an electric vehicle and don't use a lot of gas. Let them have a cool tote bag or a cool sticker for their water bottle if they're being environmentally friendly. If we can change the norms and our expectations for how much people will impose external costs on others, then we might have a good chance of shifting to a better social optimum. And so I would argue that this is a lot of what like the hashtag One Colby campaign has been about. Is wearing a mask is an activity that has an external benefit for other people. And so if you can reward people who are following that or shame people that aren't, you can move to the socially optimal amount of mask wearing. So I want you to just pause and make sure that you understood the Coase theorem as I explained it, and then you're done with externalities.